think that's right there in the permission. I think I'm right.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Matt.
That's right. I don't need to start again.
It might be worth just starting again. Sorry.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Sorry for that interruption. We started and then I was informed there was a slight technical glitch. My name is Malcolm Tull. I'm from Murdoch University. This paper is a joint presentation from my PhD student who wrote his thesis some years ago now, and myself. And we're talking about Port Hedland, approximately from 1860 to 2010, a tale of three boomers. I'm looking at the development of the port in 6 broad time periods, and hopefully the meaning of those time periods will become clearer as the discussion progresses. For those of you who don't know, Western Australia has a coastline of over 12,500 kilometres, and historically has depended on shipping for the carriage of cargoes, and in the past, people as well. The ports serving WA and this vast coastline range from very minor ones serving coastal vessels in the fishing industry to major deep water ports carrying our international trade. Now, one very important point about the fortunes of ports is that they can wax and wane, not simply as a result of endogenous constraints and limitations, but also due to exogenous factors, and in particular the impact of trade and shipping. As a result, some are now defunct, and so, for example, in the northwest we have a port called Cossack, which once was quite a bustling little port, now completely defunct as a port, and others have been transformed from backwaters to major ports, and Port Hedland is a prime example of this. In 2021, Port Hedland's exports totaled 725 million tonnes, mainly iron ore, and it was the world's largest bulk export port. So what I'm trying to do today is to look at the development of Port Hedland from an economic backwater to a major and leading world port export port. Well, these are just a few shots of the Port of Cossack, which once was thriving with pearling and other activities. Today it's just a heritage site. This is a map of Western Australia. For those of you who don't know the geography, we're currently here down in Fremantle or Perth, and Port Hedland is way up here. And Western Australia basically accounts for about a third of the total area of Australia. So it's a huge state. Now, ports have a number of characteristics. Briefly, basically their physical location is fairly static, but they're exposed to constantly changing global market conditions. And in particular, a lot of the decisions that affect the future of ports are made, not in Australia in fact, but by international shipping companies and by shippers who choose destinations and channels for their trade, imports and exports. They've got high levels of asset specificity, which means that they're susceptible to inefficiencies, such as the hold-up problem and rent-seeking behaviour. And so, also, of course, if they fail to operate efficiently, then that can impose significant economic and, in some cases, social costs as well to society. So, achieving success in this kind of environment requires not just flexibility from public and private actors and port operators and port users, but also from institutions that constrain the rules of the game, if you like. Institutions can be thought of as the combination of formal constraints, informal rules, and enforcement characteristics. And essentially, the goal of institutional analysis is to evaluate the economic efficiency and distributional implications of given institutional structures. And due to their asset specificity, ports, and I quote, can be locked into an inefficient institutional arrangement due to sunk costs in existing institutions and network externalities among institutions. And Australian ports have had a long history of institutional inertia. That's been due to a variety of factors. Firstly, monopoly power exercised by unions, the waterfront unions. Secondly, concentrated market structure, which is especially an issue in the containerisation era from the 1970s onwards. And then thirdly, the management practices of port authorities, which until at least the 1980s were often very backward and inward-looking. To change this rigidity or to break through usually requires a trigger of some kind. And these institutional trigger points can come from wider processes of reform. And in Australia, we have the classic example of the process of microeconomic reform in the 1980s, which led to a whole range of improvements, including in the port structure. Private infrastructural investment will not occur if it is easier to capture rents by lobbying the state. And this is, of course, the fundamental rent-seeking insight of Mentor Olson. And obviously, this can be a factor that can affect decisions about institutional structure and capital investment. And what can happen, and has happened, in fact, in many situations, is you get a path-dependent outcome where future generations, quote north, inherit the artificial structure the institutions believe tools, techniques, and external symbol storage systems from the past. So we can get a situation where we've got institutional rigidity, potential for rent-seeking behaviour, and a difficulty for making a transition to a more efficient institutional structure. And that usually requires a trigger point of some kind. Okay, now, after that brief sketch of the framework, let's try and apply it to the history of Port Hedland. It was discovered as a port April 1863 by Captain Peter Headland, commanding officer of the Ministry, and the Surveyor General Charles Cook Hunt. Shortly after discovery, they renamed it Port Hedland, and it had the attraction of being a natural sheltered harbour. Had a sandbar, a tidal sandbar that prevented ships from passing at low tides, but it was certainly earmarked initially as a place to establish pastoral activity, to land sheep and develop pastoral activity. But there was a lack of ready availability of water, development languished, and the only users of the port were in fact pearling loggers engaged in the pearling trade. And in fact, to put this in a broader context, until the discovery of gold in the 1880s, the whole colony of Western Australia was essentially an economic backwater. I think Frank Rose, who of course used to be a professor of history at this university, summed it up very well when he said that its significance to the British Empire was little more than its red colour on the map. So certainly before the 1880s then, Western Australia struggled. There was a bit of an economic backwater. The turning point came with the discovery of gold in the 1880s. Port Hedland's proximity to discoveries of marble, wire and milligine saw it emerge as a potential export facility. But there are major obstacles. Upgrading the port, for instance, was hampered by the funding issue. How do you fund major infrastructure? When the whole population of Western Australia, that is the white population, it was only about 50,000, and of course the indigenous population was unknown in terms of its numbers. So really there was not a tax base that could be used to fund substantial infrastructure. Private investment also was deterred by a lack of clear mining rights and entitlements, and also by an ill-fated Duty upon Gold Act of 1886. This was to put a tax on gold. It was attempting to obviously generate revenue for the government, but it was a complete failure. In fact, I think it lasted for just over a year or so and only generated about £27 of revenue because, of course, everyone was trying to desperately avoid paying it. Finally, in 1896, the state government commissioned the construction of the jetty and the causeway, and that was completed 3 years later. Ironically, of course, the first shipment of gold bullion from Headland occurred in 1900, by which time the Pilbara gold rush was ending, and of course the focus was shifting to the goldfields centred around Kalgoorlie, much further to the south. So the situation of Port Hedland was summed up much later by the first harbour master, Geoffrey Monks, and basically he said, and I quote, "To get into the port you had to cross a sandbar. It was on the side, and you had to wait until there was enough water for the ship to cross over the bar. Once you did, and you got inside the harbour, well, then you were trapped there until the next high tide came to let you out." So it was always quite exciting. The image shows the Port Hedland jetty in 1910, and in the background you can see some pearling motors, which are, of course, were at that stage still very active users of the port. These are some shots basically showing the perils of the port at that time. You can see the SS Minderoo, which was a state shipping vessel, aground in the Port Hedland harbour in 1935 when the skipper miscalculated the tidal range. So I think you get the picture. It wasn't really that great a port in those days. Probably the next major development which had impacts for the Northwest was the election of the Labour government of Katanning in 1911, which implemented a short-lived policy of state socialism, basically buying up, establishing all sorts of state-owned businesses, most of which failed fairly quickly. One that was enduring was the state shipping service, which of course was the result of petitioning by Kimberley interests for a shipping service between the Northwest and Fremantle. And the state shipping service used to famously advertise that even when the roads were washed out or non-existent, they could still operate. It continued in operation until 1995, in fact, and it had the distinction of never actually making a profit. And so, although it was long-lived, I guess an example of the political lobbying of Northwest interests, it was never a financial success. Now, the Katanning era is only a brief one, but certainly it established a pattern in Western Australia of governments of all political persuasions continuing to play an active role in promoting economic development. So a movement away from the Katanning's direct involvement, but certainly always has been historically an active role by the state in Western Australia in promoting economic development. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a lot of interest in developing the Pilbara, primarily because of an increase in the price of coal. But the state government still struggled to fund major infrastructure, particularly in more remote areas. In 1926, the federal government in Canberra offered to take over all Western Australia north of 26 parallel and assume liability for its loan debt in that territory. But this offer was rejected by the government of Western Australia. It was seen as a ploy to prevent succession. Obviously, as is well known, WA voted to succeed in 1933, although constitutional issues prevented that from occurring. So essentially, we're in a situation where you've still got major transactional cost issues deterring private interests, and neither the Commonwealth nor the state had the ability or willingness to develop a region. So Port Hedland essentially then continued as an economic backwater. Moving forward to the post-Second World War era, the next major boom, as it were, potential boom, was due to manganese. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 caused prices of manganese to soar about 284% between 1940 and 1947. And the discovery of the mineral Woody Woody, which was about 400 kilometres southeast of Port Hedland, led to the first exports out of Port Hedland in 1953. But these were only a trickle. Exports were slow to take off. And there were a number of reasons for this. First, the imposition of a virtual trade embargo by the federal government on manganese exports. But essentially, what was introduced was a regulation requiring every company that wanted to export manganese had to get a separate export license. And so this meant the whole process was bogged down in bureaucracy and process. And the effect of this essentially was to favour established interests, principally BHP, at the expense of new entrants. BHP, in fact, enjoyed a dominance. It had sufficient manganese that it could obtain below world prices in Australia. So this was one difficulty. Secondly, the state regulation of mining tolls and prospecting was still vague and inadequate in terms of establishing firm title, which was a deterrent to private investment. Thirdly, port facilities were pretty poor. The first shipment of less than 5,000 tonnes took 23 days to load on the Turnberg, the first vessel that was at port. And this was actually, even by those standards, a very slow load rate. Other ports in other parts of the world were doing it in a fraction of that time. The poor port facilities were a reflection of a number of factors, but partly also finally a lack of effective management. Port Hedland was controlled by the Harbour and Lights Department based in Fremantle, so there was no independent port authority for the region or for the port. And this meant action and responses and development processes were all very slow and cumbersome. Sorry, what have I done? On the wrong way. Okay, that just shows you a graph of manganese production and prices. You can see WA production doesn't really take off until the 1960s. And then, of course, the price boom subsides as well, following the ending of the Korean War. So, basically, private interests reacting to the potential profit opportunities began to lobby for an institutional shift. And some of the private companies, like the Northern Mineral Syndicate, spent quite a bit in improving infrastructure in the northwest, providing access to Port Hedland through a road, for example, from its mine, its manganese mine. And finally, in October 1957, the state government approved money to extend the Port Hedland jetty, and these works were completed by 1960. But as with the gold boom in the late 19th century, this was a case of too little, too late, with 1957 proving to be the peak of the manganese boom, and thereafter prices subsided. Change of direction, a federal iron ore embargo introduced in 1938 was finally removed in 1960. And this embargo has ostensibly been introduced because Australia was short of iron ore, but of course the reality was there were huge deposits. And what it did was remove any incentive to exploit those deposits and explore for further deposits, although some exploration, of course, did take place in secret. But aided by a boom in Japan, which drove iron ore prices through the roof, business and international interest put immense pressure on the federal government to lift the embargo, and also for the state governments to provide clearer title to iron ore. I'll skip this one, it just shows the process of access. The potential profit of iron ore was so large, it helped break the path-dependent outcome and induced a change both in the federal and state institutions. And the 1964 agreement with Mount Goldsworthy became the pattern for all subsequent agreements, a model on which other pioneer agreements were based. And these agreements represented the first time that large-scale private investment in port infrastructure in Pilbara became viable. The government was committed to granting title and mineral rights in exchange for an agreed amount of royalties. And the private companies undertook or agreed to undertake most port investment. This was driven by a number of government ministers, but of course Charles Tull played a key role starting from when he was Minister for Industrial Development for government from 1959 onwards. And this was, as I said, the pattern in Western Australia where governments of all political persuasions played an active role in promoting development, including development in the northwest. You get the establishment of a joint venture with BHP close to Port Hedland. You get construction of massive private infrastructure and a very rapid expansion of Port Hedland. And by 1971, it was Australia's largest export port when it's measured by tonnes. So you can see here pictures from that period of the early facilities and the development of the port. And a key factor that's highlighted, in fact, in the picture on the left particularly, is the role played by international shipping technology and the development of very large bulk carriers, which provided scope for enormous economies of scale and lowered the cost of transporting iron ore, which was a relatively low-value commodity on world markets. And that just shows you the massive expansion that occurred in iron ore exports, and indeed has continued to this day. Now, one thing that was missing was the modern port authority, and the port essentially was operated by the consortium until 1970, when the Port Hedland Port Authority was constituted. And this was obviously an important step in providing effective management of the port, but it had a number of unusual characteristics. Of course, the benefit for the private companies was that it meant they had a state guarantee of obligations, which effectively lowered their cost of funding port infrastructure by providing underwriting and providing guarantees, which lowered the cost of obtaining funds. And the Act gave the companies representation on the board, so they were effectively able to control their development. Major working expenses were covered with revenue from a port improvement rate, and the process were basically returned to the mining companies. So this, although it was a modern port authority, it had some unusual characteristics. Eventually, as part of a reform process that occurred from 2012 onwards, these arrangements were changed, and of course the Port Hedland authorities now merged with other Northwest Port authorities into Pilbara ports, and so the situation has now changed. But up to 2010, this was the situation applying to Port Hedland. Okay, so to sum up then, ports exhibit institutional rigidity and self-reinforcing path dependence. Transaction costs were very high and influenced by the institutional constraints that the private sector in particular faced in trying to develop mining and port activity in the Northwest. There was a gold boom in the 19th century, a manganese boom in the early 1950s, but entrepreneurial opportunities were lost because of high transaction costs, partly due to government failures. In a sense, most public investment was too little, too late. Institutional reform was needed to break out of this institutional rigidity and to allow Port Hedland to thrive. This chart just traces historically the process from period of lock-in, weak profit rights. I haven't talked about the details of the war. War was obviously first and second. Lock-in, embargoes lifted, state agreements, and then of course creation of modern port authority. So the reform trigger that came was caused by a combination of factors. Firstly, of course, private companies and ports clamouring for change as a result of the potential profits on offer. Secondly, technological change in shipping, which I already mentioned, particularly development of bulk carriers, positive state government development policy, and the development of vertically integrated change by mining companies, that is, they own the infrastructure, the roads, the railways, and so on. And the port facilities that actually export the ore. Following the first export of iron ore from Port Hedland in 1968-69, Western Australia ceased to be a claimant state in the Federation. Up until that point, under the federal state financial system in Australia, Western Australia had been a deficit state, if you like, receiving net benefits via transfers from the rest of the country. This changed from 1968-69 onwards. And of course, today, it's a very different scenario where Western Australia, of course, is one of the more successful states in the Federation. Port Hedland is currently the world's largest bulk export port, with exports including not only iron ore, but lithium and salt and other commodities. So I guess the broad message is that institutions do matter. Institutional rigidity didn't help, in fact, impaired the development of the port. And it took major triggers, finally, of course, the iron ore boom, to transform Port Hedland from an economic backwater into a major world port. This is a shot of the modern port, and it's a very efficient port by world standards. Australia historically has often been seen as a relatively poor performer in terms of port efficiency. But actually, that's really something that's more of the ports that handle containers and general cargoes rather than bulk handling ports. And the reforms of the 1980s and 1990s improved rates of efficiency in container ports considerably, although we're still arguably lagging behind all of this practice. But in terms of bulk ports, and these have achieved much higher status in terms of their efficiency and performance in recent years. Okay, I think I'm probably about out of time. I'm going to stop.
Perfect, actually. Timing's absolutely perfect. Congratulations, and on recovering from that, that technical hitch. We've got no questions in the chat. Are there any questions from the floor?
I'd like to ask one. Okay. The claimant state being revoked in, I have a suspicion that that's an institutional change in itself, rather than us being better, because we had systematic destabilisation introduced. It was a relativity system, and we still have a relativity below one, still being subsidised.
Yes, you're right. I mean, that was just I suppose I highlighted that as a kind of turning point, but obviously that was the beginning of the process. Yeah.
So, you made a comment about the Goldsworthy Agreement in '64, I think it was.
Yeah.
Up to that point, the property rights in the National Iron Ore was quite weak, and after that, it was strengthened.
Correct.
In what way what terms was it strengthened?
I think the issue was providing a clear process and a clear entitlement to those to enable them to exploit the facility. One of the issues, particularly if you go back to the mining sector, was a lot of confusion about the implementation of enforcement rights, particularly in more remote areas. And that was a handicap in the 1880s, and not to the same degree in the 20th century, obviously, but it was still an issue of clarifying and providing clear title so that mining companies had the security to invest substantially. This is now backed by clear legislation in the state parliament.
Thank you very much. And now I'll ask Andrew Pickford to come and present. Andrew, did you put your this one, Andrew? Yeah.
Thank you, David, and thank you for convening this summit. I'm going to talk today on gas innovation. So is it today?
Oh no, that's fine. It should be all right. Can you see that okay, Lionel?
No, it's still Malcolm's slides on screen share. So you need to stop screen sharing, David, I think, and then start again.
Can you hear that?
Not yet.
Sorry, folks. Should be able to share it now. Can you see it now, Lionel?
No, I think you have to stop the previous share.
David, do you need to press resume share at the top?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Now can we see it? Yeah, it's great when it works, absolutely.
There you go. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to follow on, and I think Malcolm's presentation has really given some very good background. I'm looking at the period 1880 to 1912. So what I'm going to talk about the WA difference, and this is in terms of economic development of themes that we've touched on in the first presentation. Also look at the political economic context and the commercial framework of capital raisings and deployment. I've got two sub-periods, period before gold and after gold essentially, and I'm going to ask the question, was there a difference in gas innovation? And when I talk about gas, this is a bit later on, this is a gasimeter in East Perth. It is essentially the gasification of coal, which is distributed through main pipes to, it was originally used for lighting and then transitioned into cooking and heating and to the purposes we use today. So the WA difference. So there's a few, this is a theme of the summit, there's a few thoughts about, are we a different to other Australian colonies and other British colonies. A few things to consider is that we were settled relatively late. David has flagged in his research the long stagnation, which was a formative period in our sort of institutional organisation and essentially being a port state. This is Geoffrey Bolton's reflections on Port Hedland's biography, and interestingly, he essentially, I won't read this out, but he sort of points to something that we were very moderate. We had a consensus, and we sort of missed out some of the radical approaches that swept through other colonies. I argue that the difference was that we had a very tight consensus of elites with a common purpose and overlapping interests, and that would be a conflict of interest in the contemporary setting, but in that era was an agreement between political economic elites to move the state ahead, especially ideas that were formed before we had the influx of gold, with the 1880s as a pivotal example. Now, I've listed the Forrest family, and I was referring primarily to Alex Forrest as the case study, but as the namesake and the newspapers indicate, the descendant conflates personal, state, national and international interests together. In many ways, that's a succession of that sort of thinking which is born in Western Australia. So I'm going to drill down and talk a little bit about the gas sector, how it formed, and why this is a useful case study for the difference. Just to give some context, these are the two sub-periods identified. Again, 1890 is a very rough indication of when the gold rush accelerates. So in this early era, which I argue is a really pivotal period, you had experimentation to attract capital, bootstrapping, and what we now refer to as public-private partnerships, the de-risking that Malcolm talked about, and the use of concessions, which are arguably proto-state agreements. After gold happens, you had essentially a lock-in process. You had less pressure for institutional innovation, and I think of the Olsen and North slide is just insert that there, because that's the path dependency is a very, very relevant for this high capital expense. Now, this is the end of the era, and I'll really conclude, even though it happened in 1911 onwards with Scadden and state socialism, it did a lot of institutional changes to the energy sector that resulted in WA essentially going from having nothing here to having effectively a state-owned generation capacity by 1912, which is quite unusual in terms of comparison states. So if we look at the commercial framework, in this era you have the legacy of the UK legislation and WA variations of company formation. The other way to essentially establish a company was a special act of parliament. If you go back to that long stagnation period, you look at the instruments that Governor Weld used, and this was essentially to bring about larger holdings of timber concessions to make them economically viable. So it again it's a predecessor to the iron ore and resources sector, where he lobbied to be given greater control to give a larger concessions and then made them economical. And I think that those ones in the debates over the land grant railway, especially the Great Southern Railways, were influenced by this model because it essentially gave, again, this is not an old West Australian innovation, but it gave a template to attract capital and do a form of concession, PPP if you want to call it that, which de-risked the investment and is really a predecessor of state agreements, and it is that scale and exclusive control, which again played out in the north as well. So if we look at the beginning of this era, the 1880s are still seen in West Australian history as a really a non-event at the time before gold. If you look at some of the commentary and views at that time, there was things stirring in Western Australia. This is from 1881, basically lamenting at the lack of progress, to use the word of the era, about the larger capital infrastructure and economic development. So these sort of sentiments were quite common in the writing and in the papers of this time, and there was small uptick. So as a very imperfect proxy for looking at the 1880s, I essentially used Trove to identify the mentions of prospectus. Now, of course, there'll be some double ups, and of course, some may be advertising London investments, but it's just a crude measurement of how often prospectus was mentioned in the West Australian press. Now, of course, as we get into the gold time, we would expect these numbers to be quite high. That's a given. But if you look back, and I haven't got the 1870s, it was very, very low, double digits at most for the 1870s. So in this period here, it's before gold, but you are seeing something is happening in Western Australia and in essentially domestic capital formation. So we look to the beginning of the gas era. Now this, I think, is the first energy logo ever in Western Australia, which I came across in the archives. And just confusing, the names of these two companies are very similar. So the Perth Gas Company was formed in 1882. It was described in the era as an experiment. They were undercapitalised. They only had £5,000 and they had trouble collecting that through the shareholders fully. They used a novel technology which, if you're reading the board reports, the promoter of the technology is sort of, I would put it in the category of a spruiker. It was novel at the time, which was seen as a way for skipping some of the earlier lessons. It was very problematic. The wheels started falling off in the mid-1882, and essentially it went through disputes with the inventor of this novel gas technology, troubles with deployment, and it really didn't get any momentum for some time. So what happened is towards the end of this period, in late 1882, they were looking for other options, and essentially they wound it up to reorganise it to launch another entity. You have in 1883 the successor, and again the names are confusing, the Perth Gas Company, as opposed to the City of Perth. Gas Company was formed quite shortly afterwards. They're common directors. So essentially in what contemporary terms, they recapitalised it. They went for a higher base of about £15,000, so they had some capacity to fuel growth. They went for a very proven UK standard technology, and the directors were very cautious. They go through street by street, almost lamp by lamp, in justifying the expense and just moving it out and doing a very slow build out. As was this, you have the company existed as a legal entity, but what further happened, and this goes to Malcolm's presentations, this is a proto-state agreement. Essentially, it's an exclusive, it provides this company the exclusive rights to supply gas within 5 miles of the GPO. And this was relatively standard type of a gas concession agreement that was imported from the UK. It was had the provision for a buyback by the state at a set period of 21 years, which we'll come to in a bit. And it further de-risked it and allowed it to, with confidence, fund the expansion of the gas service for context, at this time, it was essentially just in the Perth CBD. The original gas plant was where the blood bank is now, on Wellington Street near the railway station, just opposite the Western Power Building. And it would have only served a very small number of those sort of people and institutions within that area. So the second period, as I said, is gold. So John Forrest towers over there, but I would argue Scadden is his influence in state socialism, but in the energy sector is probably very understated, and also his time in the Mitchell government, which is interesting as well. So gold is seen historically in Western Australian terms as a shock which upended the status quo. Now, if you look at this Perth Gas Company, these are extracts from the annual report. What's interesting to note is that it was producing a dividend in this period, 1886. Now, arguably gold had not yet transformed the economy. So through this cautious, very traditional approach, and the directors were liaising closely with the Perth City Council, they were liaising closely with the government, and they were essentially, through a mediated agreement of deploying this asset, they were able to produce a profitable business, and the dividends were really, they shifted a bit higher in later years, but it was essentially making money from this point. The other interesting thing is there was no economic regulator at the time, so any pricing and structural things was done on an informal basis. What essentially it looks like, and it's not stated in the minutes, is they kept the dividends between 10 and 15%, and kept pulling this down as they got scale. So there was essentially a buying consensus where they weren't going to have pushback, but they could make a healthy, safe return. So that was happening pre-gold, and it just accelerated after that. The other interesting thing is that they, through a form of, I would say, relevant to the era, but a very aggressive form of lobbying to secure the electricity monopoly within the same area of 5 miles of the GPO. Again, it was not unusual in the era, but I think how they achieved it would make Eddie O'Deed and the New South Wales property developers proud, is through that tight interlinking, which in that era of elite interest was not unusual, they were able to lobby to get not only the monopoly, but enacted through an Act of Parliament, so they could service electricity and gas within that Perth GPO, which was, again, most entities tended to put them separately because at the time they were competing for lighting, and the jurisdictions liked competitive tension, so one couldn't essentially internally slow down and price accordingly to extract more rent from the population. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. So you had this, essentially this lock-in that the period of gold was a period of growth, healthy dividends. As you had the increasing capacity of the state, they exercised their clause to nationalise. This actually caused a very long-running dispute over the treatment of goodwill, went up to the Privy Council, and essentially it was transferred to the City of Perth, and this allows the issue of debentures by the City of Perth to fund its purchase and essentially pay out the shareholders. So this asset became owned by the Perth City Council, so local government at this stage in 1911. So this is a very quick tour of those two periods, and I'm just going to just elaborate a bit more to return to the question of my paper. So there was quite tight connections between these two elites prior to the gold rush. Now, I argue that in that period of the 1880s, there was a lot of institutional innovation and understandings which were locked into a large degree well before we had an influx of both government revenue and private capital. It was profitable for the gold rush. So it was a very small city then. So the de-risking process and understanding between private entities, local council and state government was very tight, and they made it work despite it being very poor and a very small customer base. There was a comfort with a tight monopoly, and I say monopoly in both geographical and the two competing energy and gas sources, again, which was a bit unusual, but accepted at the time. Essentially, this monopoly was nationalised and put to the city of Perth. The reason why Malcolm's presentation before me was very useful is that this period of 1911 and afterwards is really key to the direction. And I know this wasn't successful in terms of the trading enterprises, but what Scadden did in the energy sector was quite interesting, because even though the city of Perth nationalised the generation plan, what the directors did when they knew it was going to be nationalised, they essentially stopped funding any capital improvement, and they just pushed and pushed, so it was going to be spinning off dividends. So the city of Perth inherited a clapped out old generation plan. The shareholders got the money. What they also did is, because Scadden took over the railways, there was a large need for power, and Scadden had a very broad vision. He wanted to electrify right up to Northam and down south at a very early period. So there was a need for an understanding to get that, you needed a large central plant for efficiency. So to essentially do that, the state underwrote and built what became the East Perth Power Station, and there's gas works associated, or that they were City of Perth, but the electricity generation by 1912, even though it wasn't built for a number of years, was owned by the state. You have the state as a central player in this energy framework, and you had a comfort of the concentration of power and using those levers to achieve those goals, which you see echoing in Pilbara. Now, afterwards, the reason that it was sort of a WA difference is after this, it didn't really get challenged. This was locked in, and arguably until the Carnegie reforms, when you started to get the deregulatory era, we had this centralised East Perth-based monolithic player that aided in development and economic development unchallenged. And even to the point that James Mitchell appointed Scadden as the Railways Minister, which is where energy, it was the de facto energy portfolio, continued this trend. And there was a brief flirting with privatisation, which was killed in the 30s. But the fact that Scadden could go and work for a Conservative government, again, I haven't looked at this in depth, but I find that very interesting, because it shows that between the two major parties, there's a real agreement, and also the business elites that continues to present. Now, all of this manifests in the approach of Charles Court, which he really continues using this and the instruments available to him, and the institutional innovations from the 1880s, which favoured very large concessions and agreements to de-risk, and using the relatively novel use and continued use of state agreements, which is essentially a legislative act of Parliament. So thank you for your time, and if you've got time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Any questions on chat, but has anyone got any questions they'd like to pose to Andrew?
I might just ask, at what point or what period would Kalgoorlie have places like Cranberry get gas?
A bit later. Right. So I know Kalgoorlie got electricity relatively early. The first one, interesting, I didn't have time for this. Katanning actually had a electricity service relatively early in public. What happened, they tended to be the local governments would essentially contract out. So Geraldton, Albany, and Fremantle were the other gas services, but because we were relatively late, it was mainly, a lot of them skipped directly to electricity. And distributing gas in a small area, you need scale, so we just don't have the population centres to service. So we had that, and then again, I haven't had time, but there was efforts again in this period to drill for oil in Princess Royal Harbour through a similar concession agreement. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
We have one. There's something going on with state government buying up state enterprise and giving to local government. The City of Perth did exactly the same thing. What happened with water? That's from Jenny Gregory.
Oh, yes. So Jenny, thank you for listening, and Jenny is one of my co-supervisors, and I like the fact that the water followed a similar pattern. It's not in my I haven't looked at it closely, but essentially there was attempts in the 1880s to have from what I understand, private investment in simply because the governments couldn't afford them, they didn't have the tax base. So after that, water similarly drifted to local and state government relatively quickly, basically as soon as the tax base permitted. So there's always a preference to shift to state level if local governments or private couldn't fund it.
Variation on a theme. Does much of the history of the gas that you're looking at have any implications for the way natural gas is done from the state?
It is to the fact that you had, if you had the introduction, it was used.
This decision is very disappointing. I mean, look at the Australian state.
It was.
You've got a gas company.
So the question is from Rico is, what does that have for natural gas? And again, I think Colin, you might be able to help me on that. In 72, you had the Dongara gas field, and essentially what Sir Charles Court used, he used SEC as a way to help underwrite the push through pipeline legislation and underwrite the bringing gas down and switching off the gas, town gas, so you decommission that and use natural gas, and that for some is seen as a dry run for the Dampier to Bunbury pipeline and the North West Shelf of de-risking at a high level. So it gave the government the instruments to de-risk and the instruments to engage with commercial players and provide the infrastructure and legislative support to quickly get it up and going. If you look at the natural gas, it was pushed through in a very short time, obviously before environmental regulations came up, but the speed at which it deployed was because, I would say, because of this.
Fantastic. We'll take one last question, sir.
And a really quick one. It might be worthwhile looking at the telegraphic system, where we all had a trial run of government assisting private investment. the first time Perth Fremantle was a group of merchant bankers, a group of the merchants. Yeah. But when he wanted to expand that system, so he got that group together and underwrote their investment by giving a guarantee of I think it was a 5% return, paid by government return. So they were advertising their prospectus. They were a guaranteed return, whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I'll just briefly do that because I know you can't get a break. Weld is very interesting in this pre-gold rush era, and he was clearly a very competent administrator who could see that he didn't have much to work with and was more comfortable. He also lobbied the Colonial Office to give himself freedom to, again, I'll put that in the bootstrap PPP, but thank you for that. And it fits in with that, giving it a go and finding out things that work in WA that push through into the contemporary era.
Welcome to Great Papers. We are going to go to morning tea in a second, but before we do, John Roberts has just got a quick announcement that he would like to make.
Sorry to interrupt your conference, but I'm the president of the Economic Society of Australia WA branch, and we have a small announcement to make today. The branch has, over many years, awarded distinguished economists for their contribution to profession, the society, and economics more generally. In 1987, this award was named the Austin Holmes Award after a well-known West Australian economist. The first award was made in 1987 to Professor Norman Duffy, who some of you probably remember. The award was presented by Austin's wife in April 1988. Austin had passed by then. And her visit to WA was funded by the Reserve Bank of Australia. And Austin spent a large part of his career working at the Reserve Bank. The most recent recipient of the award is Professor Ken Clements, sitting over in the corner there. But before announcing, I want to announce our next award winner today. Before doing so, I thought it might be worthwhile, given you people are interested in economic history, just to give you a potted history of Austin Holmes, and it's going to be very short. But Austin was born in Narrogin in 1924 and was raised on a wheat sheep farm in Dumbledore. So humble beginnings. Following the Second World War, where he actually served in the Royal Australian Air Force, he completed a Bachelor of Arts at UWA and graduated in 1949, first class honours and a Hackett Fellowship, which took him to Cambridge University, in particular Clare College. And there he completed another Bachelor of Arts in 1952 and later a Master of Arts in 1957. Must have done that one externally or part-time because in 1952 he returned to Australia and took up a lectureship at the University of Queensland. His research that he was carrying out there prompted the Commonwealth Bank to offer him a 2-year contract in 1957 to compile flow of funds estimates. To undertake that work, he moved to Sydney, and he also held a position at the University of New South Wales as a senior lecturer. In 1960, he joined the staff of the newly formed Reserve Bank of Australia. And from 1966 to 1973, and then 78-81, he was head of the Reserve Bank's research department. In between those periods, he went to Canberra and worked with the Commonwealth, firstly in the Department of Special Minister for State, and then later the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Austin was one of the forerunners of the arguments for market-determined interest rates and the floating exchange rate, so he was probably a little ahead of his time. And while in Canberra, he argued and lobbied hard for tariff cuts, reductions in subsidies and other structural reforms. So you can start to see that this Austin was well ahead of his time. Interestingly, in 1980, he delivered the Giblin Memorial lecture, which he called The Good Fight. Some of you may have already heard about that. In the Good Fight lecture, he referred to the struggle to get good sense, and by that I think he meant economic rationality into our economic affairs, and more specifically into economic policies which influence those affairs. Now, with rigorous analysis and persistence, he gradually persuaded others, including academics and politicians, bureaucrats, and journalists of the merit of the cause. He retired in 1986, and unfortunately he died in July 1986 in Alice Springs, of all places. But as is typical of Austin, he was there supervising PhD thesis. So it brought a quick closure to what was an illustrious career. So that's Austin Holmes. That's the person we've named our award for, because we think it's very appropriate, given his background. But now to the Austin Holmes Award. It gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Economic Society to announce that the award for 2021, the award winner is Professor Michael McClure. Before Michael comes forward to receive the award. I'll just quickly run through his resume now, which I've trimmed down a little bit because it's pretty impressive. But as probably you all know, he's Professor of Economics at UWA. His long-term projects have included intellectual histories of Pareto, and in fact, I'm told he learnt Italian to enable him to undertake a lot of that work. AC Pagoo and the Cambridge School, they've been the centre of his research interest, but he has engaged in other work along the way. But his research is focused on the history of economic thought, and some of the major works, if I read them, co-editor of the English translation of Pareto's Manual of Political Economy, a critical and variorum edition, author of the Paretian School in Italian Fiscal Sociology at Belgrade Macmillan, inventor of his articles in the History of Political Economy, European Journal of History of Economic Thought, Cambridge Journal of Economics, the History of Economics Review. Michael has contributed to the profession and academia in a number of ways. He's a member of the UWA Academic Board. He's, as I mentioned, a long-standing member and president of the Economic Society of Australia WA branch. I think it's 23 years. You told me, Michael, you're a committee member?
Yeah, committee.
And he was the president for a number of years. I can't remember how many, but four. So he's made a significant contribution to the society. Most recently, as initially co-convener of the Australian Conference of Economists in 2020, which was postponed due to COVID. He then continued to work with us in 2021, in particular in pulling together a program and selecting papers for presentation. So a mammoth task as well. He's founder of the very successful Philosophy, Politics and Economics stream at UWA, and founder and convener of the UWA History and Philosophy of Social Sciences Network, a multidisciplinary cross-university research group that's been established. And as I mentioned earlier, co-convener of the Conference of Economists. In 2020, October to be exact, he was awarded the Premio Galileo Galilei by the, I'm reading this as Italian now, so I should actually get Michael to tell me, but basically, Fondazione Premio Internazionale Galileo Galilei the Rotary Club Italiano for his contribution to the history of economics, Italian economics. Michael was telling me that because of COVID, he's been unable to actually get to Italy to receive the award, so that's something in the offing. But Michael's contribution is also evident in the time and focus he undertakes in order to promote the study of economic history of economic thought, and the economics at the undergraduate, postgraduate level at the university. At a personal level, I've known Michael for a number of years and always found him very approachable and a source of excellent advice and wisdom. So, as I said, it gives me great pleasure to award Michael the Austin Holmes Award for 2021. Congratulations, Michael, well done.
A couple of words.
Say a couple of words, yes.
First thing, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I think we're getting a photo.
You are, with lots of words like Katanning written on your face at the same time. I'll get one out.
We'll get one later.
What an honour, what an absolute thrill and pleasure for anyone who works in economics to be acknowledged by their peers, and particularly to the Economic Society, which is a body which I have so much respect for and value. And secondly, to follow in the footsteps of the wonderful Ken Clements to receive this award is another humbling experience. I'd also like to say that I had the honour and distinction of writing the entry on Austin Holmes
for the Australian and New Zealand Biographical Dictionary of Economists. And he's a man I too respect greatly. The good fight is actually a great motto for economists. You know, we have to fight the good fight. We can't win everything. That was Austin Hunt's point. You don't kind of ditch over nothing. You have to be strategic in how you do things. So I admire the man. To have a prize named after that man, who I admire, from the Economic Society, which I'm a proud member of, and you know, from John as a colleague in the society. It's such a wonderful feeling, and so, I'm speechless and will probably shed a little tear in a moment. Thank you so much.
Good morning to you. So just out in the foyer, please go and enjoy yourself there. If you could be back at about 2 minutes to 11, because of course we'll have our minute silence at 11 o'clock and then proceed to the next set. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken.
Oh, yeah, yes.
You kept a little secret.